Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Three in the morning. It's always 3 in the morning when I wake up hearing those sounds again. My new house is over 1,000 miles from Olympic National Park, but still, I still hear them. My wife says they're just nightmares. She wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw that October night. My name is Silas Brennan, and I need to tell someone this story. It's been 3 years since I left my job as a forest ranger and moved from Washington State to Arizona. 3 years since I traded the endless rain and towering cedars for desert sand and scorching sun. My therapist says the extreme change was my way of running from what happened. Maybe she's right. All I know is that every drop of rain here reminds me of that place, and every shadow between the saguaro cacti makes me think of the spaces between those massive trees where anything could be hiding. I worked as a ranger at Olympic National Park for 18 months when it happened. 18 months. Barely enough time to know the main trails, let alone call myself experienced. But I thought I knew everything. Fresh out of training, full of textbook knowledge and desperate to prove I belonged there. The other rangers, the veterans like Martinez and Collins, they tried to teach me patience, tried to tell me that the forest would humble me eventually. I wish I'd listened. The call came in on October 15, 2021, around 4 p.m. The autumn light was already fading fast in the Pacific Northwest. That gray twilight that makes the rainforest feel like it's closing in on you. Dispatch reported a missing person. Celeste Ravenna, 23 years old, graduate student from the University of Washington. She'd been conducting research on old-growth ecosystem dynamics in the Hoh rainforest section of the park. Her faculty advisor expected her to check in by 2 p.m., but her satellite communicator had gone silent the night before around 8:30 p.m. I remember the details because I wrote them down obsessively. That was my thing back then, taking meticulous notes, following every protocol to the letter. I thought that's what made a good ranger. I was wrong about a lot of things. Celeste had permits for a 3-day solo research trip, camping at designated backcountry sites along the Hoh River Trail. She was studying fungal networks in old-growth cedar stands, something about how mycorrhizal connections changed in trees over 500 years old. Her research required her to hike deep into areas where most tourists never ventured, places where the forest canopy was so thick that noon felt like dusk. Martinez was supposed to handle the search, but his daughter had broken her arm that afternoon, and he'd already left for the hospital. Collins was dealing with a group of hikers who'd gotten lost near Hurricane Ridge. That left me, the rookie, to coordinate the initial response. I should have waited for backup. Protocol called for at least 2 rangers on any missing person search, especially in the Hoh area where cell coverage was spotty and the terrain could turn deadly without warning. But I was thinking about Sarah Chen. Sarah Chen was a hiker who'd fallen and broken her leg on the Enchanted Valley Trail during my 2nd month on the job. I'd been too cautious, too by the book, calling for backup and waiting for the helicopter instead of attempting a rescue myself. By the time we got her out, hypothermia had nearly killed her. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The incident report didn't blame me directly, but I could see it in Martinez's eyes, in the way Collins started double-checking my work. I'd failed to act when action was needed. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I loaded my pack with standard search gear, GPS unit, emergency radio, first aid kit, emergency beacon, 3 days of food, water purification tablets, headlamp with extra batteries, emergency bivvy, and my service weapon, a Glock 22 that I'd qualified with but hoped never to use on anything bigger than an aggressive black bear. The weight felt reassuring on my belt as I headed out on the Hoh River Trail around 5:30 p.m. The trail starts gentle, winding through second-growth forest where Douglas fir and western hemlock create a green tunnel overhead. But as you go deeper, the trees get bigger, older, more primordial. Sitka spruce that have been standing since before Columbus reached America tower 300 feet above you, their trunks so massive that 5 people holding hands couldn't wrap around them. The understory becomes a maze of fallen logs covered in thick moss. Nurse logs that have been decomposing for centuries while supporting entire ecosystems on their backs. It's beautiful during the day. At night, it becomes something else entirely. I reached Celeste's first permitted campsite around 7 p.m., just as the last gray light was filtering down through the canopy. The site was empty, but that wasn't unusual. Researchers often moved their camps based on where their work took them. Her permit allowed for flexibility as long as she stayed within designated areas and checked in daily. What bothered me was the silence. The Hoh rainforest is never truly quiet. There's always something: the drip of moisture from leaves, the scurry of small animals, the distant call of owls or the bark of deer. But this section of trail felt muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. Even my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the spongy earth. I pressed on to her second permitted site, another mile deeper into the forest. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness, creating a small bubble of visibility in the vast black. The trees pressed close on both sides, their moss-covered trunks like the walls of a living cathedral. Every few steps I'd stop and call out, "Celeste, this is Ranger Brennan with the Park Service. Can you hear me?" Nothing but the echo of my own voice bouncing off the massive tree trunks. The second campsite was also empty, but here I found the first sign that something was wrong. Celeste's research equipment was scattered around the clearing: a digital caliper, soil pH meter, collection vials, and sample bags. They weren't just dropped. They were arranged in a rough line pointing deeper into the forest, like someone had deliberately placed them to create a trail. I knelt down and examined the equipment with my flashlight. No damage, no sign of an animal attack. But the arrangement was too precise to be accidental. The caliper pointed northwest toward a section of forest that wasn't on any official trail. The pH meter was 20 feet beyond it, also pointing northwest. The vials were scattered in the same direction. My radio crackled to life. "Brennan, this is dispatch. What's your 20? "About 2 miles up the Hoh River Trail at Research Site B, I responded. "I found some of the missing person's equipment, but no sign of her. The gear appears to have been arranged." "Arranged how?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "Like someone wanted me to follow it. Equipment is placed in a line pointing off trail to the northwest." Static filled the radio for several seconds. "Copy that. Are you requesting backup?" This was the moment. The decision that would change everything. I should have said yes. Should have waited for Martinez or Collins, or at least for morning when visibility would be better. But I was thinking about Sarah Chen. About proving myself, about a young woman who might be injured and alone in the forest. "Negative on backup. I'm going to follow the trail while it's fresh. We'll check in every hour." "Roger. Be careful out there, Brennan." I clipped the radio back to my belt and studied the tree line where the equipment pointed. There was no official trail in that direction, but I could see what looked like broken branches about 8 feet up on a massive cedar, as if someone had pushed through and disturbed the understory. I marked my location with a GPS waypoint and headed into the unmarked forest. The moment I left the established trail, the forest changed. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches interlocking overhead like fingers. My headlamp beam became my entire world, a small cone of white light surrounded by impenetrable black. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen logs and hidden holes where root systems had rotted away. Every few steps, I'd sink ankle-deep into soft moss that concealed rocky crevices or thorny devil's club. About a quarter-mile from the trail, I found Celeste's backpack. It was hanging from a branch about 7 feet up, too high for her to have placed it there herself unless she'd climbed the tree. But why would she do that? The pack was intact, unopened, and when I managed to retrieve it with a long branch, I found it still contained her sleeping bag, camp stove, and food. Everything a researcher would need to survive in the wilderness, except her satellite communicator was missing. I tried my radio. "Dispatch, this is Brennan. I've located the missing person's backpack, but there's no sign of her. Equipment suggests she may have been traveling northwest from the research sites." Static. Then more static. I adjusted my radio settings and tried again. Nothing but white noise. The silence that followed felt different from before. Not peaceful. Watchful. Like the forest was observing me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I could feel sweat forming under my uniform despite the October chill. The beam of my headlamp seemed weaker, though I just put in fresh batteries before leaving. I hung Celeste's backpack from my pack and continued northwest, looking for more signs of her passage. The terrain was getting rougher, with steep ravines and fallen trees creating a maze of obstacles. This wasn't an area where someone would willingly travel, especially not a young woman conducting research. The vegetation was too thick, the going too difficult, unless someone was forcing her to go this way. That thought hit me like ice water in my veins. I'd been assuming Celeste had gotten lost or injured. But what if someone had taken her? What if the arranged equipment wasn't a trail left by accident, but bait deliberately placed to lure a rescue team into the forest? I stopped walking and listened. The silence was complete now. No dripping, no small animal sounds, nothing. Even the wind had died. It was as if every living thing in this section of forest had fled or was hiding. I drew my weapon. The Glock felt familiar in my hands from countless hours at the range, but holding it in the dark forest made everything real in a way that training never had. My finger stayed outside the trigger guard, but I kept the barrel pointed forward as I continued through the trees. Another quarter-mile brought me to a small clearing where several massive trees had fallen in some long-ago storm, creating a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering trunks. In the center of the clearing, barely visible in my headlamp beam, was a camp. But it wasn't Celeste's camp. The setup was military precise. A camouflaged tarp stretched between trees, a small fire pit that had been cold for hours, and gear arranged with the kind of organization you only see in people with serious outdoor training. Combat boots sat next to the fire pit, size 11 or 12, far too large for a 23-year-old graduate student. A military-style sleeping bag was rolled with perfect hospital corners, and hanging from a rope between two trees like laundry left to dry were pieces of Celeste's clothing. Her University of Washington sweatshirt hung limp in the still air. Below it, her hiking pants, her socks, her underwear. Each piece had been carefully arranged, displayed like trophies, but no blood, no signs of violence. The clothes looked like they'd been removed carefully, almost gently. I approached the camp with my weapon raised, calling out, "This is the National Park Service. If anyone is in this camp, identify yourself." No response. I swept the area methodically, the way they'd taught us in law enforcement training. The camp was empty, but it had been occupied recently. The ashes in the fire pit were still warm when I held my hand over them. A military-style MRE package sat next to the sleeping bag. Beef stew, eaten within the last few hours based on the smell. Whoever had been here was gone, but they'd be back. I tried my radio again. "Dispatch, this is Brennan. I've found what appears to be an unauthorized camp in the Olympic backcountry. Missing persons' clothing has been found at the site. I need immediate backup and possibly law enforcement." Static. I checked my GPS unit. The screen showed my location, but the coordinates seemed wrong. The device claimed I was 3 miles further north than I'd calculated. I tried to get a satellite fix, but the signal kept cutting in and out. That's when I heard it. A woman's voice calling for help. Faint, distant, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Help me. Please. Someone help me." Every instinct told me it was a trap. The camp, the clothes, the convenient cry for help just when I'd found evidence of foul play. It was too obvious, too perfectly timed. But what if it really was Celeste? What if she'd escaped from whoever had taken her and was out there alone and terrified in the dark forest? I couldn't ignore it. I marked my location with another GPS waypoint and headed toward the voice, moving as quietly as I could through the undergrowth. The calls came sporadically, always from the same general direction, but never quite the same spot. Whoever was calling seemed to be moving, staying just out of reach. "Help! I'm hurt! Please!" The voice sounded young, female, desperate. But something about it bothered me, like a song played slightly off-key. I'd heard recordings of Celeste's voice from her research interviews. This sounded similar, but not quite right. I followed the calls for what felt like hours. Though my watch showed only 45 minutes had passed, the terrain got progressively worse. forcing me to climb over fallen logs and push through dense thickets of salmonberry and devil's club. My uniform was soaked with sweat and torn in 3 places. The beam of my headlamp was definitely getting weaker now, even though the batteries should have lasted for hours. The calls stopped. I stood in the middle of what looked like a natural maze of fallen trees and listened. Nothing, not even the sound of my own breathing, seemed to penetrate the suffocating silence. That's when I realized I was being watched. It started as a feeling, that primitive awareness that comes from thousands of years of human evolution. The sense that predator eyes were tracking your movements, calculating distances, waiting for the right moment. I spun in a slow circle, my weapon raised, trying to penetrate the darkness beyond my failing headlamp. "I know you're out there," I called. "This is the National Park Service. If you have Celeste Ravenna, release her now and we can work this out." A sound drifted through the trees, low, rumbling laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then a voice, definitely male, speaking from the darkness. "You're not very good at this, are you, Ranger?" The voice was calm, educated, with just a hint of a southern accent. It came from my left, but when I turned toward it, I heard footsteps moving to my right, fast, confident steps that barely disturbed the forest floor. "Where is she?" I demanded, trying to track the movement in the darkness. "Safe," the voice replied, now coming from behind me. "For now, but that depends entirely on you." I spun around, but my headlamp revealed only empty forest. Whoever was speaking was staying just outside my circle of light, moving with a silence that spoke of serious training. "What do you want?" I asked. "What I want," the voice said, now from my left again, "is for you to understand how completely unprepared you are for this situation, how utterly out of your depth. You're not a real ranger, are you? You're just a boy playing dress-up in the woods." The words hit harder than they should have because they echoed my own doubts. I was out of my depth. I was unprepared. I was exactly what he said, a rookie who'd bitten off more than he could chew. "Let her go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever problem you have is with the Park Service, not with an innocent researcher." "Innocent?" The laughter came again, closer this time. "Oh, Ranger, you really don't understand what's happening here. Celeste isn't innocent. None of you are innocent. You come into my forest, trampling around with your rules and your permits and your self-righteous certainty that you belong here. But this is my home. Has been for 3 years now, and you're all just visitors." "Your forest?" I turned slowly, trying to keep track of the voice as it moved around me. "This is a national park. It belongs to the American people." "Does it?" The voice was closer now, maybe 20 feet away. "Tell me, Ranger, how many nights have you spent alone in these woods? How many winters have you survived out here with nothing but what you can carry? How many times have you tracked a deer for 3 days, learning its habits, understanding its fear?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. "I thought so. You're a tourist with a badge. But don't worry. I'm going to teach you what it really means to be hunted." My headlamp chose that moment to flicker and die. The darkness that engulfed me was absolute. In the city, there's always some light, street lamps, neon signs, the glow from windows. But in the deep forest, on a cloudy night with no moon, darkness is a living thing that presses against your skin and fills your lungs. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the clip on my belt. Every sound seemed magnified. My breathing, the rustle of my uniform, the slight creak of leather from my gun holster. "Scared?" the voice whispered, so close I could feel breath on my neck. I spun and fired. The muzzle flash lit up the forest for a split second, revealing massive tree trunks and hanging moss, but no human figure. The gunshot echoed through the trees like thunder, then faded into silence. "Now that wasn't very smart," the voice said, amused. It was coming from my right now, maybe 15 feet away. "You just told every animal within 5 miles exactly where you are. And more importantly, you showed me that you're afraid enough to shoot at shadows." I finally got my backup flashlight working. The beam was much weaker than my headlamp had been, casting a small circle of yellowish light that barely penetrated the darkness. I swept it in all directions, but saw nothing except trees and undergrowth. "Who are you?" I called out. "Name's Duncan Corwell, though I don't suppose that means anything to you. I used to be Staff Sergeant Corwell, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Specialized in reconnaissance and survival training. The Army taught me how to track, how to hunt, how to disappear. Useful skills, as it turns out." The name did sound familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it. "What do you want with Celeste?" "Want with her?" Duncan's laughter drifted through the trees. "Oh, Ranger, you still don't understand. I don't want anything with her. She's just the bait. You're what I want." "Me?" "Not you specifically. Any of you. Rangers, cops, search and rescue teams, anyone arrogant enough to think they can walk into my territory and take what's mine. I've been waiting for someone like you for months, someone young and inexperienced and desperate to prove themselves." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. "How long have you been watching the park?" "Long enough to know your patrol schedules, your radio frequencies, your protocols. Long enough to know that Ranger Martinez has a daughter with a history of broken bones, and that Ranger Collins gets pulled away for tourist rescues at least twice a month. Long enough to know that when a missing person report comes in on a Friday evening, they'll send the rookie." He'd planned this, all of it. Celeste's disappearance, the scattered equipment, the camp with her clothes. It was all designed to draw a ranger into the forest alone, and I'd walked right into it. "Where is she?" I demanded. "Alive, for now. But that's going to depend on how well you play the game." "What game?" "The oldest game there is, Ranger. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted. I'm going to give you a head start, let's say 10 minutes. Then I'm going to track you through my forest using everything the Army taught me about hunting dangerous prey. If you can make it back to the main trail before I catch you, you both go free. And if you catch me..." The silence stretched out for long seconds. "Then, let's just say that Celeste's research on ecosystem dynamics is about to get a lot more hands-on." I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, but Duncan was gone. No footsteps, no rustling branches, nothing to indicate which direction he'd moved. He'd simply melted back into the forest like he'd never been there. I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. If I was going to run, now was the time. But I couldn't leave Celeste. Whatever game Duncan was playing, she was an innocent victim caught in the middle. I couldn't abandon her to whatever he had planned. I tried my radio one more time. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Brennan. I have a code black situation in the Olympic backcountry. Armed and dangerous subject, missing person confirmed in custody. I need immediate backup and law enforcement response." Static. I tried my emergency beacon. The device beeped twice and went silent. Either the battery was dead or something was jamming the signal. My GPS was showing impossible readings again. According to the screen, I was somehow 15 miles northwest of where I'd started, deep in wilderness that would have taken days to reach on foot. But that was impossible. I'd been hiking for maybe 6 hours, and I'd never left the general area around the Ho River Trail. Unless Duncan had done something to my equipment. Military training would include electronic warfare, ways to disrupt communications and navigation systems. He'd been planning this for months. He'd have had time to figure out how to isolate his hunting ground. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I spun around, but my weak flashlight beam revealed nothing. Just the endless maze of moss-covered trees and fallen logs that made up the Olympic rainforest. In the daylight, it was one of the most beautiful places on Earth. In the darkness, it was a labyrinth designed by nightmares. Another sound, closer this time, the soft whisper of fabric brushing against bark. "Time's up, Ranger." Duncan's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the massive tree trunks. I couldn't tell which direction it was coming from, or how close he was. I ran. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I crashed through the undergrowth, trying to retrace my steps back toward the main trail. But nothing looked familiar. The forest that I'd navigated slowly and carefully on the way in had become an alien landscape of obstacles and dead ends. Fallen logs blocked my path, forcing me to climb over or crawl under. Dense thickets of devil's club tore at my uniform with thorns that went right through the fabric. Hidden holes sent me stumbling to my knees in soft moss that seemed designed to trap unwary feet. Behind me, I could hear Duncan moving through the same terrain, but his passage was nearly silent. While I crashed and stumbled, he flowed through the forest like he was part of it. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, or hear the soft sound of a branch being carefully moved aside. He was hurting me. I realized it after the fourth time I found my path blocked by impassable terrain, forcing me to turn in a specific direction. Duncan wasn't just chasing me. He was controlling where I went, driving me deeper into the forest and further from any hope of rescue. I stopped running and tried to think. Panic was making me stupid, causing me to react instead of plan. I was a park ranger, trained in wilderness survival and navigation. I needed to start using my head instead of just my legs. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The forest around me was silent, but not the natural silence I'd noticed earlier. This was the silence of a predator moving carefully through the darkness, trying not to alert its prey. I could hear it now that I was standing still, the almost inaudible sound of boots on soft earth, maybe 50 yards to my left. Duncan was flanking me, trying to get ahead so he could drive me back in the direction he wanted me to go. But if I knew where he was, I could avoid him. I could move perpendicular to his path and maybe break out of whatever trap he was laying. I waited until the sounds moved past my position, then headed in the opposite direction, moving as quietly as I could. Without the flashlight, navigation was almost impossible, but I tried to maintain a straight line by keeping one of the massive Sitka spruces on my right as a reference point. For about 10 minutes, it seemed to work. I was making progress through the forest without any sign that Duncan had noticed my change of direction. Maybe I could outthink him after all. Maybe my training was worth something. Then I walked into the wire. It caught me across the chest at about shoulder height. Thin, nearly invisible cable stretched between two trees. I hit it hard enough that it knocked the wind out of me and sent me staggering backward. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound it made. The wire was connected to something, a can full of pebbles, or maybe pieces of metal. When I hit it, the whole contraption went off like a rattlesnake's warning, filling the forest with noise that seemed to go on forever. "Very good, Ranger," Duncan's voice called out from somewhere ahead of me. "You almost broke out of the funnel, but almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades." I turned on my flashlight and saw them. Tripwires crisscrossing the forest in every direction except the one I'd originally been running. Duncan had been herding me into a corridor lined with noisemakers, ensuring that any attempt to deviate from his chosen path would announce my location. "How long have you been setting these up?" I called out. 3 months, give or take. Ever since I identified this area as the perfect hunting ground. Remote enough that no one would hear gunshots or screaming, complex enough terrain to provide interesting challenges, and far enough from the main trails that search teams would take days to find anything. The Park Service will send people looking for me. Eventually, sure, but not until you miss your next check-in, which isn't for... I heard him pause, presumably checking a watch. "Another 6 hours, and then they'll search the area where you were supposed to be, not where you actually are. By the time they expand the search grid to include this section, well, let's just say the Olympic rainforest is very good at making things disappear." He was right, and I knew it. I deviated so far from my planned route that any search would start miles away from my actual location, and with my radio and GPS compromised, I had no way to signal my position even if a search team did get close. I was on my own. I started moving again, this time following the path Duncan had laid out for me. I didn't have much choice. The tripwires made deviation impossible, and standing still would just give him time to close the distance. At least by moving, I was making him work for his victory. The corridor led steadily uphill, through increasingly difficult terrain. I found myself climbing over massive fallen logs and picking my way around steep ravines. My flashlight was getting dimmer with each passing minute, and I was down to my last set of spare batteries. That's when I smelled the smoke. It was faint at first, just a hint of wood burning somewhere ahead, but as I continued up the slope, The smell got stronger. Someone had built a fire and not too far away. I crested a small ridge and saw it. A campfire burning in a natural clearing maybe 100 yards ahead. The light looked warm and welcoming after hours of stumbling through the dark forest. But more importantly, there was someone sitting next to the fire. A small figure wrapped in what looked like a blanket. Celeste. She was alive, sitting by the fire like she was camping. From this distance, she looked unharmed, though I couldn't make out details. She wasn't tied up or restrained in any way that I could see. It was obviously a trap. Duncan was using her as bait, counting on my need to rescue her to draw me into whatever ambush he'd prepared. But what choice did I have? I couldn't leave her there, regardless of the risk. I approached the clearing carefully, using trees for cover and trying to spot any signs of Duncan's position. The fire was built in the center of the clearing, providing good visibility in all directions, but also making anyone near it a perfect target. Classic military tactics: control the terrain, control the light, control the engagement. Celeste? I called out softly. The figure by the fire looked up. It was definitely her. Young, blonde, wearing the University of Washington sweatshirt I'd seen hanging in Duncan's camp. But something about her posture seemed wrong, too stiff and mechanical. Ranger? Her voice was weak, barely audible. Is someone there? It's Ranger Brennan with the Park Service. Are you hurt? I don't think so, but I can't move very well. He gave me something, some kind of drug. Everything feels distant and slow. Rohypnol, maybe, or some other incapacitating agent. Duncan would have had access to military drugs during his service, and he'd clearly planned this operation with military precision. Keeping Celeste alive but compliant would be standard procedure for using a hostage as bait. I studied the clearing for several more minutes, looking for any sign of Duncan's position. The trees around the fire were massive old-growth specimens, their trunks easily wide enough to hide behind. The undergrowth was thick enough to provide concealment, but sparse enough to allow good fields of fire. If Duncan was out there with a rifle, he could pick me off the moment I stepped into the open. But I couldn't wait forever. Dawn was still hours away, and Celeste needed medical attention. Whatever drugs Duncan had given her, they could be dangerous if she didn't get treatment soon. Celeste, I'm going to come get you, but I need you to listen carefully. When I say move, I want you to get away from the fire as fast as you can. Can you do that? She nodded, but the movement looked sluggish and uncoordinated. I took a deep breath, drew my weapon, and stepped into the clearing. Nothing happened. I moved quickly toward Celeste, sweeping my gun from side to side and trying to watch all the potential ambush points at once. She looked up at me with glassy, unfocused eyes, and I could see she was definitely under the influence of something powerful. Can you walk? I asked, kneeling down beside her. I think so, but everything's so fuzzy. I helped her to her feet and she leaned heavily against me. Whatever Duncan had given her was affecting her balance and coordination, but she seemed strong enough to move if I supported her. We need to get out of here, I told her. There's someone in these woods, someone dangerous. He's the one who took you. Took me? She looked confused. I don't remember being taken. I remember setting up camp and then nothing. I woke up here a few hours ago. That fit with Duncan's MO. He'd probably drugged her at her original campsite, then moved her to this location while she was unconscious. The arranged equipment I'd found was meant to lead me here, to this trap, but where was he? I helped Celeste away from the fire, moving toward the edge of the clearing where the trees would provide some cover. My flashlight was almost dead now, barely casting enough light to see the ground in front of us. That's when I heard the applause. Slow, deliberate clapping that echoed through the forest. Duncan stepped out from behind one of the massive trees, maybe 30 feet away, perfectly positioned so that the firelight illuminated him while keeping me in shadow. He was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-30s, military bearing, wearing woodland camouflage that looked like it had seen actual combat. But what I hadn't expected was how ordinary he looked. No wild eyes or obvious signs of mental illness. He could have been any veteran you'd meet at a VFW hall or working construction in any American city. "Very touching," he said, still clapping. "The brave ranger risking his life to save the innocent researcher. It's like something out of a movie." I kept my gun pointed at him, but he seemed unconcerned. His hands were empty, but I could see the outline of a rifle slung across his back. "Let us go, Duncan. You've had your fun, but this ends now." "Oh, but we're just getting to the good part." He smiled, and for the first time I saw something genuinely unsettling in his expression. "You see, Ranger, this whole thing has been a test. A way to measure what kind of man you really are when everything's on the line. Test of what? Whether you're a sheep or a sheepdog. Whether you have what it takes to do what's necessary when the rules don't apply anymore." He gestured toward Celeste, who was barely staying upright despite my support. "She's not just a victim, you know. She's a choice." "What are you talking about?" Duncan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. In the firelight, I could see it was a key. "See, the thing about Celeste here is that she's not just drugged. She's wearing a little present I made for her. A vest with about 2 pounds of military-grade explosives. Very unstable stuff, triggered by a dead man's switch that's currently in my pocket." He held up the key. "This little beauty is the only thing keeping her from being scattered across 3 counties. My blood went cold. Now here's your choice, Ranger. You can shoot me, in which case my finger comes off this trigger and your precious researcher gets to experience what it feels like to be the center of a very small sun. Or you can put down your weapon, accept that you're not the hero of this story, and we can discuss terms." I looked at Celeste. She was staring at me with those drugged, unfocused eyes, probably not even understanding what Duncan had just said, but I could see it now. The bulk under her sweatshirt that I'd mistaken for layers of clothing. The slight protrusion that could easily be an explosive device. "You're insane," I said. "Am I? Or am I the only one being honest about what humans really are when you strip away all the civilized pretense?" Duncan's finger never moved from the trigger. "You want to know what I learned in 5 tours overseas, Ranger? I learned that every person has a breaking point, every single one, and I learned that when you push someone past that point, you see who they really are underneath all the bullshit. What do you want? I want you to understand that your training, your protocols, your whole worldview is built on a lie. You think you're prepared for the worst-case scenario? You think you know what evil looks like?" He smiled again, and this time it was genuinely terrifying. "You have no idea." My gun was still trained on him, but my hands were starting to shake. The weight of the weapon seemed to increase with each passing second. If I shot him and he was telling the truth about the dead man's switch, Celeste would die. But if I put down my weapon, we'd both probably die anyway. "Here's what's going to happen," Duncan continued. "You're going to put down that gun and kick it away. Then you're going to walk over to that tree." He pointed to a massive cedar about 20 feet to my left. "And you're going to handcuff yourself to it with your own restraints. And then? Then we're going to have a conversation about what it really means to be helpless. About what it feels like when all your training and all your equipment and all your self-righteous confidence doesn't mean shit." I could feel Celeste trembling against me. The drugs were wearing off enough that she was starting to understand the situation, and her breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. Panic attack probably, which could be dangerous given whatever was still in her system. "Time's running out, Ranger. My finger's getting tired." I looked at Duncan's face in the firelight and realized he wasn't bluffing. There was something in his eyes that spoke of genuine madness. Not the wild, obvious kind, but the cold, calculating insanity of someone who had crossed a line and could never come back. He would kill us both without hesitation if I didn't comply. I slowly lowered my weapon. "Good choice." Duncan nodded approvingly. "Now kick it away." I placed the Glock on the ground and kicked it toward the fire. It landed about halfway between us, close enough that Duncan could reach it, but too far for me to make a grab without him noticing. "The handcuffs are on your belt. Take them out slowly." I reached for the restraints with one hand while keeping the other arm around Celeste. She was starting to hyperventilate, and I could feel her legs getting weaker. "It's going to be okay," I whispered to her, though I didn't believe it myself. "Now walk to the tree." I helped Celeste move toward the cedar Duncan had indicated. The tree was enormous, probably 8 feet in diameter, with bark so thick and rough it looked like armor plating. If I cuffed myself to it, there would be no way to break free without tools. "One hand," Duncan instructed when we reached the tree. "Loop the chain around the trunk and cuff your left wrist." I hesitated. Once I was restrained, there would be nothing stopping him from doing whatever he wanted to, both of us. Do it now or she dies. I clicked one cuff around my left wrist and looped the chain around the massive trunk. The cedar was so wide that the chain barely reached, but it was enough. When I closed the second cuff, I was effectively pinned to the tree with maybe 3 feet of movement in any direction. "Perfect." Duncan walked over and picked up my gun. "You know, you lasted longer than I expected. Most people break a lot sooner when faced with an impossible choice." "What now?" I asked. "Now? Now we get to the real fun." He reached into another pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like a garage door opener. "See, the thing about explosive vests is that they're not just weapons. They're psychological tools. The fear of detonation is often more effective than the actual explosion." He pressed a button on the device. Nothing happened. "Oh, did I forget to mention?" Duncan laughed. "There never was any explosive. The vest is just a prop, something I put together with road flares and duct tape. Looks convincing in the dark, doesn't it?" Relief flooded through me, immediately followed by rage. "You son of a bitch. Now, language." Duncan walked over to Celeste, who was standing near the fire looking confused and terrified. "The fake bomb was necessary to get you to cooperate. But don't worry, the real threat is much more personal." He grabbed Celeste by the arm and dragged her closer to the fire. In the brighter light, I could see her more clearly. She was younger than I'd thought, maybe 21 or 22, with the kind of innocent face that belonged in a college yearbook, not in the middle of a psychopath's game. "You see, Ranger, the thing about being a predator is that you have to understand your prey. You have to know what motivates them, what scares them, what makes them willing to do things they never thought they'd do." Duncan pulled out a combat knife, military issue, the kind designed for killing rather than utility work. "And what motivates you, clearly, is this misguided sense of responsibility for other people's safety." He held the knife to Celeste's throat. "So here's the real choice. I'm going to hurt her. Slowly, methodically, in ways that will take hours to kill her. And you're going to watch, knowing that you could have prevented it if you'd just been smarter, faster, better at your job. Don't do this, Duncan. She's innocent. Innocent." He pressed the knife against her skin, not quite hard enough to draw blood. "She's a representative of the system that sent me to kill people in countries I couldn't pronounce for reasons no one could explain. She's part of the machine that chews up people like me and spits us out when we're no longer useful. There's no such thing as innocent. That's not her fault, isn't it? She goes to her comfortable university, studies her comfortable subjects, never thinking about the price that people like me pay to keep her world safe and clean. She's as guilty as anyone." I tested the handcuffs, but they were solid steel and properly locked. The chain was tight enough that I couldn't reach Duncan or Celeste, couldn't do anything but watch. "Please," I said, hating the desperation in my own voice. "Take me instead. Let her go and do whatever you want to me." "Oh, I'm going to do plenty to you, Ranger, but first you get to watch what happens to people you failed to protect." He drew the knife across Celeste's arm, not deep, but enough to draw blood. She screamed and tried to pull away, but the drugs were still affecting her coordination. She stumbled and fell next to the fire. "Stop!" I shouted, pulling against the handcuffs hard enough to cut into my wrists. "I'll do anything you want, just don't hurt her." "Anything?" Duncan looked interested. "That's a big word, Ranger. Are you sure you mean it?" "Yes." Tell you what, I'll make you a deal. Answer one question honestly, and I'll make her death quick instead of slow. Lie to me and she suffers for hours." I didn't answer. There was no good choice here. No protocol that covered this situation. The question is simple, Duncan continued. When you were chasing me through the forest, when you thought I was just some crazy person who might hurt your precious researcher, did you ever consider that maybe I was the victim? Did you ever wonder if maybe I had a good reason for doing what I was doing? What? It's a simple question, Ranger. It's a simple... When you found my camp with her clothes, when you heard her voice calling for help, did you ever once consider that there might be more to the story? That maybe she wasn't the innocent victim you assumed she was? I looked at Celeste, who was holding her bleeding arm and staring at me with terrified eyes. What was Duncan talking about? I don't understand. Of course you don't. Because you're exactly what I thought you were. A small-minded functionary who sees the world in black and white. Good guys and bad guys. Victims and perpetrators. Never any shades of gray. He walked over to his pack and pulled out a manila folder. Celeste Ravenna, he read from what looked like an official document. Graduate student in marine biology, University of Washington. Also part-time informant for the DEA, specializing in identifying illegal marijuana grows on federal land. My blood went cold. 3 months ago, she helped federal agents identify and destroy a cultivation operation that belonged to my brother, Marcus Corwell, disabled veteran trying to make ends meet growing medical marijuana on what he thought was abandoned forest land. The DEA raid went bad. Marcus panicked, tried to run, got shot in the back by a trigger-happy agent. Duncan's voice was perfectly calm, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes. He died 3 days later in a hospital bed alone, because I was too far away to get there in time. 26 years old, Purple Heart recipient, survived 2 tours in Afghanistan just to get killed by his own government in a forest in Washington state. Duncan, she knew. He pointed at Celeste with the knife. She knew Marcus was a veteran. She knew he was disabled. She knew he was growing marijuana to pay for medical treatments the VA wouldn't cover. And she turned him in anyway because it was her civic duty. I looked at Celeste again. She wasn't meeting my eyes anymore. Is that true? I asked her. She didn't answer. Of course it's true, Duncan said. Why do you think she was really out here, Ranger? She wasn't studying fungal networks. She was looking for more grow operations to report to her federal friends. This whole research trip was a cover story. The pieces started falling into place. The isolated location, the solo trip, the sophisticated equipment that seemed like overkill for a graduate student project. If Celeste was working with federal law enforcement, she'd have access to funding and gear that most researchers could only dream of. But that doesn't justify... Justify what? Duncan interrupted. Justice? My brother is dead because of her. The system failed him. The VA failed him. And when he tried to take care of himself, she made sure that failed too. That's not how justice works. Isn't it? Tell me, Ranger, what would have happened to her if I'd gone through proper channels, filed a complaint, hired a lawyer, tried to work within the system? I didn't answer because I knew he was right. Nothing would have happened. Informants were protected and Celeste had been doing her legal duty by reporting illegal activity on federal land. Exactly. The system protects people like her and destroys people like Marcus, like me, like you, eventually, when you stop being useful. Duncan walked back over to Celeste and grabbed her by the hair, forcing her to look up at him. So here's the real question, Ranger. Now that you know the truth, are you still so eager to save her? Now that you know she's not an innocent victim but an active participant in a system that kills people like my brother? I stared at Celeste, trying to process what Duncan had told me, if it was true, and something in her expression suggested it was. Then this wasn't a simple case of a psychopath attacking random victims. This was revenge, twisted and evil, but not entirely without cause. She still doesn't deserve to die, I said finally. Doesn't she? She made a choice. She chose to prioritize following orders over protecting a fellow human being. She chose to value abstract law over mercy. Why shouldn't she face the consequences of that choice? Because that's not how civilization works. We have courts, due process. Courts? Duncan laughed bitterly. Due process? You mean like the due process my brother got when they shot him in the back? You mean like the fair trial he would have gotten if he'd lived? I wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Everything Duncan was saying resonated with doubts I'd had about the system I worked for, questions about whether justice and law were really the same thing. I can see you thinking, Ranger. I can see you starting to understand. The world isn't as simple as your training manual makes it seem, is it? Even if everything you're saying is true, I said slowly, killing her won't bring your brother back. No, but it might prevent her from destroying someone else's life. Duncan pressed the knife against Celeste's throat again, harder this time. A thin line of blood appeared on her skin. Last chance, Ranger. Are you going to watch an innocent researcher die, or are you going to watch a federal informant face justice for her actions? I looked at Celeste, really looked at her, trying to see past my assumptions and prejudices. She was young, frightened, probably convinced that she'd been doing the right thing when she reported Duncan's brother, but she was also part of a system that had destroyed a family and created the monster that was now holding a knife to her throat. Don't, I said. But I wasn't sure if I was talking to Duncan or to myself. Don't what? Don't give her what she deserves? Don't make me choose. But that's exactly what I'm doing. Because choices define us, Ranger. They show us who we really are when everything else is stripped away. The knife moved slightly, and Celeste whimpered. Please, she whispered. I was just doing my job. I didn't know. I didn't think. You didn't think about the consequences, Duncan agreed. You didn't think about the human cost. You just followed orders like a good little soldier. He was right, and that's what made this so horrible. In a world of absolute moral clarity, this would be easy. The psychopath was evil, the victim was innocent, and my duty was clear. But the real world was messier than that. People made choices that had consequences, and sometimes those consequences came back in ways no one could predict. I'll make you a deal, I said finally. Duncan raised an eyebrow. Oh? Let her go, and I'll stay. I'll be your victim, your example, whatever you need, but let her walk away. Why would I do that? She's the one who actually wronged me. Because I'm the one you really want. You said it yourself. This was all about testing a ranger, seeing how the system would respond. I'm the system. She's just a cog in the machine. Duncan considered this, the knife still pressed against Celeste's throat. Interesting proposition, but you're forgetting something, Ranger. What? I don't actually need your permission. He drew the knife across Celeste's throat in one smooth motion. Blood sprayed across the firelight as she collapsed, her hands clutching at the wound. The sound she made wasn't quite a scream, more like the air escaping from a punctured tire, wet and desperate and utterly helpless. No, I screamed, pulling against the handcuffs with enough force to dislocate my shoulder. The metal cut deep into my wrists, but I barely felt it. Celeste tried to speak, but only blood came out. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes as her life drained away onto the forest floor. Why? I shouted at Duncan. Why did you have to kill her? Because that's what predators do, Ranger. We kill. It's our nature, just like following orders is hers. Was hers. He looked down at Celeste with something that might have been satisfaction. Besides, I never said I was going to let either of you go. The truth hit me like a physical blow. This had never been about justice or revenge or teaching me a lesson. Duncan was simply a killer who had found a way to rationalize his urges. The story about his brother might even be true, but it was just an excuse to do what he would have done anyway. I was going to die here, chained to a tree in the middle of the Olympic National Forest, and no one would ever know what had really happened. Now, Duncan said, cleaning his knife on Celeste's sweatshirt, let's talk about what's going to happen to you. But before he could continue, we heard it, the distant sound of helicopters. Duncan froze, tilting his head to listen. The sound was definitely getting closer, and it was coming from multiple directions. Search and rescue helicopters, probably equipped with thermal imaging and night vision equipment. That's impossible, Duncan muttered. You've been out of radio contact for hours. No one should know where you are. I didn't understand it either, but I wasn't about to question good luck. Maybe someone saw the fire, I suggested. The canopy is too thick. You can't see ground fires from the air in this part of the forest. Duncan was starting to look genuinely worried for the first time all night. Unless... His face went pale in the firelight. Your emergency beacon. I jammed the signal, but if it was transmitting on multiple frequencies... He pulled out a small electronic device and checked its display. Shit. The backup frequency was still active. The helicopter sounds were getting louder, and I could see lights beginning to sweep through the trees. Duncan had been so focused on jamming the primary emergency channels that he'd forgotten about the redundant systems built into modern rescue equipment. Looks like your perfect plan has a flaw, I said. Duncan spun toward me, the knife still in his hand. This isn't over, Ranger. Yeah, it is. The first searchlight found our clearing, turning night into blazing day. Duncan raised his hand to shield his eyes, and I could see him calculating distances and escape routes. But he was surrounded. I could count at least 3 helicopters circling the area, and the sound of voices was carrying through the forest as ground teams moved into position. Duncan Corwell, a voice boomed from one of the helicopters. This is the FBI. You are surrounded. Drop your weapons and put your hands on your head. So someone had run his name and discovered his military background. That explained the massive response. When a trained killer takes hostages in a national park, law enforcement doesn't take any chances. Duncan looked at me, then at the helicopters, then at the knife in his hand. You know what the funny thing is, Ranger? He said conversationally, as if we were just having a normal chat despite the chaos around us. I really did have a brother named Marcus, and she really did get him killed. Duncan, but that's not why I did this. He smiled, and for the last time, I saw the madness behind his eyes. I did this because I wanted to. Because I could. Because in the end, that's all any of us really are. Predators pretending to be civilized. He raised the knife toward his own throat. No, I shouted, but it was too late. Duncan Corwell died the way he had lived for the past 3 years, on his own terms, refusing to be taken alive by the system he'd rejected. His body hit the ground just as the first FBI agents reached the clearing. The next few hours were a blur of medical attention, questions, and paperwork. They airlifted me to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, where doctors treated my dislocated shoulder and the cuts on my wrists from the handcuffs. The FBI interviewed me for 6 hours, going over every detail of my encounter with Duncan. They confirmed his story about Marcus Corwell. The brother had indeed been killed during a DEA raid on an illegal marijuana operation. But they also found evidence that Duncan had been living off-grid and committing violent crimes for at least 2 years before that incident. The brother's death hadn't created a monster. It had just given an existing monster a justification for escalating. Celeste Ravenna had indeed been working as an informant, but not by choice. The DEA had pressured her into cooperation by threatening to prosecute her roommate for drug possession. She'd been trying to work off the debt by providing information about illegal activities on federal land. She wasn't a villain, just another victim of a system that used people up and threw them away. I learned all this afterward, during the investigation and the media coverage that followed. At the time, sitting in that hospital bed with my arm in a sling, all I could think about was the sound Celeste had made when Duncan cut her throat. The way her eyes had looked in those final seconds, confused and afraid and somehow apologetic. I quit the Park Service 2 weeks later. The official reason was medical leave for post-traumatic stress, but the truth was simpler than that. I'd learned something about myself in that forest clearing, something I didn't like. When Duncan forced me to choose between abstract justice and immediate mercy, I'd hesitated. For just a moment, knowing what I knew about Celeste's role in his brother's death, I'd actually considered whether she deserved to die. That hesitation lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was enough. Enough to show me that the moral certainty I'd built my life around was more fragile than I'd thought. Enough to make me question whether I was really qualified to make life and death decisions about other people's safety. So I moved to Arizona, where the landscape is harsh and honest, and there are no forests to remind me of shadows between trees. I got a job with a private security company, Work that keeps me busy but doesn't require me to be anyone's hero. My wife thinks I should go back to law enforcement, says I'm wasting my skills and experience. But she wasn't there. She didn't hear Celeste's final breaths or see the satisfaction in Duncan's eyes when he realized he'd made me doubt everything I thought I believed about right and wrong. Sometimes, usually around 3 in the morning, I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices that night. If I'd waited for backup instead of going into the forest alone. If I'd been faster or smarter or better at reading the situation. If I'd been the kind of ranger Martinez and Collins thought I could become instead of the rookie who got someone killed because he was too eager to prove himself. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. The thing about predators, I learned that night, is that they don't just hunt your body. They hunt your mind, your certainty, your faith in the basic decency of the world. Duncan Corwell died in that clearing, but part of what he was trying to do lived on in the doubt he planted in my head. Maybe that was always the real game. Maybe killing Celeste and terrorizing me were just means to an end, and the end was showing me that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we like to pretend. Maybe he won after all. I still wake up at 3 in the morning sometimes, listening for sounds that couldn't possibly be there. The desert is quiet in a way the forest never was, but somehow that makes it worse. In the silence I can hear everything. My own heartbeat, my wife's breathing, the distant hum of the air conditioner. And underneath it all, if I listen carefully enough, I can still hear Celeste trying to scream through the blood in her throat. The doctors say the nightmares will fade with time. The FBI psychologist says I did everything I could under impossible circumstances. My wife says I need to forgive myself and move on. But they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw, didn't feel what I felt when I realized that all my training and protocols and moral certainty meant nothing when faced with someone who simply didn't care about the rules that govern civilized behavior. They didn't learn what I learned, that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones who hunt for food or territory or survival. They're the ones who hunt for the simple joy of watching something innocent die, and who are smart enough to make you complicit in the process. Duncan Corwell taught me that lesson in the worst possible way, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Every time I see a forest, every time I hear about a missing person, every time someone asks me why I left the Park Service, I remember that autumn night in the Olympic National Forest when I learned that sometimes the monsters are human, and sometimes the real horror isn't what they do to you. It's what they make you realize about yourself. That's my story. That's why I moved to Arizona, why I can't sleep through the night, why I'll never set foot in a forest alone again. I'm telling it now because I think people need to know. Not the sanitized version that made it into the news reports, but the real story of what happened when a rookie ranger met a predator who understood that the cruelest thing you can do to someone isn't kill them. It's show them who they really are when everything they believe is stripped away. I still don't know if Celeste deserved to die for her choices. I still don't know if I could have saved her if I'd been better, faster, smarter. I still don't know if Duncan was right about the nature of civilization and the thin line between order and chaos. But I know I'll never forget the sound of helicopters in the distance arriving just minutes too late to save an innocent girl who may not have been as innocent as I thought. And I know I'll never forget the look in Duncan Corwell's eyes when he realized that his perfect plan had failed, but that he'd accomplished something even better. He'd made me doubt everything I thought I knew about justice, mercy, and the nature of evil itself. And in the end, maybe that was the real hunt all along. "3 in the morning. It's always 3 in the morning when I wake up hearing those sounds again. My new house is over 1,000 miles from Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but still, I still hear them. The way boots crunch through Tennessee autumn leaves. The distorted echo of a woman's voice calling for help through mountain fog. My wife says they're just nightmares. She wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw that October night in 2021. My name is Tobias Mercer, and I need to tell someone this story. It's been 3 years since I left my job as a forest ranger and moved to Nevada. The desert here is nothing like the Smokies. No thick canopy blocking out the sky, no fog that rolls in like living smoke, no sounds that bounce off mountain walls until you can't tell where they're coming from. That's exactly why I chose it. I worked as a ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 7 years. 7 years of thinking I knew every danger those mountains could throw at me. Black bears, copperheads, flash floods, hypothermic hikers who thought shorts and flip-flops were appropriate for October weather. I'd handled search and rescue operations, talked jumpers off Cataract Falls, even tracked down that cult group that was performing cleansing rituals near Cades Cove back in 2019. But I'd never encountered anything like what happened during the Delphine Carruthers case. Nothing in 7 years of training prepared me for the reality that sometimes the most dangerous predator in any wilderness isn't an animal at all. It was October 15th, 2021. The leaves were at peak color, those brilliant reds and golds that bring tourists from all over the world to East Tennessee. I remember because I'd been complaining to my supervisor, Marcus, about how the leaf peepers were making our job harder. More people on the trails meant more potential for accidents, more idiots getting lost because they were too busy taking selfies to pay attention to trail markers. I was finishing up paperwork at the Sugarlands Visitor Center when the call came in around 4:30 p.m. A missing person report. Delphine Carruthers, 23 years old, graduate student from Vanderbilt University. She'd been conducting research on Appalachian folklore and oral traditions, interviewing elderly residents in the communities around the park. Her advisor hadn't heard from her in 3 days, which was unusual since she'd been checking in daily. The reporting party was her research partner, a nervous kid named Brett who kept adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He told me Delphine had been particularly excited about a lead she'd gotten from an old woman in Gatlinburg, something about the old settlement up past Porter's Creek. She'd mentioned wanting to hike up there to see if any of the original structures were still standing. I knew the area he was talking about. Porter's Creek Trail leads to some remnants of an old Appalachian community. A few stone foundations, part of a chimney, some rusted farm equipment slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It's not an unusual destination for someone researching mountain history, but it's also not the easiest hike. The official trail is well marked, but there are dozens of old logging roads and deer paths that branch off into some pretty remote country. Brett gave me a description. Delphine was about 5'6", athletic build, long dark hair usually kept in a braid. She drove a red Honda Civic and typically wore hiking boots, jeans, and a green canvas jacket when she was out doing field work. He showed me a photo on his phone. A pretty girl with serious dark eyes and a slight smile. The kind of smile that suggested she knew something you didn't. I told Brett we'd start with the parking areas near Porter's Creek, see if we could locate her vehicle. If we found it, that would give us a starting point for a ground search. Standard procedure. I'd done it dozens of times before. What I should have done was call in additional personnel right away. What I should have done was treat this as a high-priority search from the beginning. But Delphine was an adult. She was an experienced hiker, according to Brett, and it had only been 3 days. People go off-grid in the Smokies all the time. Bad cell coverage, unexpected weather. Maybe she'd found something particularly interesting for her research and lost track of time. I found her car just before sunset. The red Honda was parked at the Porter's Creek trailhead, tucked back behind some larger vehicles like she'd been trying to be inconspicuous. When I ran the plates, they came back to Delphine Carruthers' Nashville address. The car was locked, but I could see her purse sitting on the passenger seat along with what looked like research materials. Notebooks, folders, a small digital recorder. That's when I started to worry. Nobody leaves their purse in plain sight in a parked car, especially not for 3 days. I called it in to dispatch and requested a lockout kit. While I waited, I walked the perimeter of the parking area, looking for any signs of where she might have gone. The official Porter's Creek Trail was the obvious choice, but something made me check the older paths too. That's when I found the first real clue. Fresh footprints in the mud near an unmarked trail that branched off to the east. Hiking boots. Looked like they could be the right size for a woman Delphine's height. The prints were clear enough that they couldn't have been more than a day or two old, and they were heading away from the main trail toward some of the more remote sections of the park. I followed the prints for about 50 yards until they disappeared on rocky ground, but the direction was clear. Whatever path she'd taken led up toward the old settlement areas, but via a route that wasn't on any of the official park maps. It was one of those forgotten logging roads from the 1930s, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. By the time the lockout kit arrived, full darkness was settling over the mountains. October darkness in the Smokies comes fast and thick. Those heavy canopies of oak and maple block out most of the moonlight even on clear nights. I made the decision to secure the scene and start a full search at first light. It was the right call, procedurally speaking. Night searches in unfamiliar terrain are dangerous for the searchers and often ineffective. But I kept thinking about those footprints heading off into the wilderness, about the purse left in plain sight, about how quiet the parking area was, how isolated. Most of the leaf peepers stuck to the easier trails closer to Gatlinburg. Up here you could go days without seeing another soul. I called Marcus and gave him a full briefing. We agreed to start with a grid search at dawn, bring in a K9 unit if necessary. I drove home to my little cabin near Elkmont, had a beer, tried to watch some TV. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. The next morning came with that thick mountain fog that makes the Smokies famous. Visibility was down to maybe 20 feet in some places. Not ideal conditions for a search, but we couldn't afford to wait. I met up with my partner Dave Rodriguez at the trailhead around 7 a.m., along with 2 other rangers from the Gatlinburg district. Dave's one of those rangers who's been in the park longer than some of the trees. 30 years of experience, knows every trail and most of the unmarked paths too. If anyone could help me track down where Delphine had gone, it was him. We started by following the footprints I'd found the day before. The fog made it slow going, but Dave had brought a portable GPS unit and we were able to mark our progress. The old logging road wound up into some pretty remote country, the kind of area where the Park Service doesn't maintain trails because they don't want to encourage casual hikers. About 2 miles in, we found the first piece of evidence, a small spiral notebook, the kind researchers use for field notes. It was wedged between some rocks beside the path, like it had been dropped or thrown. The pages were damp from the fog, but still readable. Delphine's handwriting was neat, precise. The entries were dated from the past week, detailing her interviews with local residents. Most of it was standard folklore research, stories about old families who used to live in the mountains, tales of moonshiners and Cherokee settlements. But the last few entries were different. She'd written about meeting an old woman named Cordelia Hicks who lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of Gatlinburg. Mrs. Hicks had told her about a place called Sorrow Hollow, somewhere up past the official settlement ruins. According to the notes, it was where a family called the Venables had lived until the park was established in the 1930s. But Mrs. Hicks claimed someone was still living up there, someone who don't take kindly to visitors. The last entry, dated 3 days ago, was just 2 lines. Found the path Mrs. Hicks described, stone markers every quarter mile, just like she said. Going to investigate tomorrow. Dave looked at the notebook and shook his head. Sorrow Hollow. Haven't heard that name in 20 years. You know the place? Know of it. It's not on any of our maps because it's not officially part of the settlement preservation area. Just some old foundations and maybe a root cellar or 2. But it's way the hell back in there, maybe 5 or 6 miles off any marked trail. Mrs. Hicks said someone was still living there? Dave shrugged. These old mountain folks, they got stories about everything. Half of them think the Cherokee are still running war parties through here. But he paused, studying the foggy forest around us. There have been reports over the years. Hikers claiming they saw smoke from campfires in areas where camping's not allowed. Hunters finding shelters that weren't there the year before. Could be squatters, could be survivalists, hell, could be nothing. We continued following the logging road for another mile before it forked. The main branch continued northwest, toward the general area where Sorrow Hollow should be. But there was a smaller path heading northeast that looked recently used. Fresh boot prints in the mud, and something else. What looked like drag marks, as if someone had been pulling something heavy. I was about to suggest we split up to cover both paths when my radio crackled. Static, then Marcus's voice. Base to Mercer, come in. Mercer here. We got another development. Nashville PD just called. They've been in touch with Delphine Carruthers' family. Turns out she'd been receiving some kind of threatening messages related to her research. Someone who didn't want her disturbing the mountain spirits or some such nonsense. My blood went cold. What kind of threats? Handwritten notes left on her car, couple of phone calls to her apartment. Nothing specific enough for the police to take action, but enough to spook her. Family says she'd been thinking about cutting her research trip short. Dave and I looked at each other. Suddenly, this wasn't just a missing hiker case anymore. Any description of the person making the threats? I asked. Negative. The phone calls were from different numbers, all prepaid cells. Notes weren't signed. But get this. One of the notes specifically mentioned the old settlements in the park. Said she needed to stay away from places that ain't meant for outsiders. Copy that. We're following her trail now, about 3 miles northeast of Porter's Creek. Found some of her research materials. How's the terrain? I looked around at the fog-shrouded forest, the barely visible path ahead of us. Remote. Real remote. Okay, I'm sending backup. Should have 2 more rangers and a K9 unit to your location within the hour. Roger. But as I clipped the radio back to my belt, I had a sinking feeling that an hour might be too long. Dave was kneeling beside the drag marks, studying them with the intensity of someone reading a book. After 30 years in these mountains, he could read sign like most people read street signs. What do you think? I asked. Someone was definitely dragging something heavy. Something about the size and weight of a person. He stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. These marks are maybe 2 days old, judging by how the rain settled in them. 2 days. That would put it right around the time Delphine went missing. We decided to follow the drag marks rather than continue on the main logging road. The path they followed was even more primitive, barely wide enough for a single person. Rhododendron thickets pressed in from both sides, and the fog was so thick in places that Dave and I had to stay within arm's reach of each other to avoid getting separated. About a half-mile down this path, we found the second piece of evidence. Delphine's green canvas jacket hanging from a low branch like a flag of surrender. There was no sign of struggle, no tears in the fabric. It had been placed there deliberately, positioned so that anyone following the path would be sure to see it. This doesn't feel right, Dave muttered, unholstering his service weapon. I did the same. In 7 years as a ranger, I'd drawn my sidearm maybe a dozen times, usually for aggressive wildlife, bears that wouldn't back down, the occasional rabid raccoon, never for a human threat. The weight of the Glock on my hip suddenly felt very real, very necessary. We continued following the drag marks. The path began to climb more steeply, winding up toward a ridge that wasn't marked on any of our topographical maps. The fog was starting to thin as we gained altitude, but that almost made things worse. Now we could see maybe 50 feet in any direction, just enough to realize how completely alone we were out here. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere ahead of us, maybe a quarter mile up the ridge. A woman's voice, high and terrified, calling for help. Dave and I looked at each other and started running. The path was treacherous. Loose rocks, hidden roots, patches of slick mud that could send you tumbling down the mountainside. But that scream had sounded like someone in mortal danger, and every instinct I had as a ranger was telling me to get there as fast as possible. We ran for maybe 10 minutes before the path leveled out on a narrow ridge. Through the thinning fog, I could see the dark shapes of structures ahead, not the neat stone foundations of the official settlement ruins, but rougher constructions, wooden shacks, some with intact roofs, Sorrow Hollow. The scream came again, closer now, definitely from somewhere in the settlement, but there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It sounded artificial, like a recording played through speakers. Dave grabbed my arm. You hear that? I listened. Under the echo of the woman's screams there was another sound, a low mechanical hum, like a generator running. Someone's got power up here, I said. Someone's been living up here, Dave corrected, pointing toward the largest of the structures. Look at the chimney. Thin smoke was rising from a stone chimney, dissipating quickly in the fog. Fresh wood smoke, not the musty smell of a fire that had been burning for days. I tried my radio. Nothing but static. We were too far from any repeater towers, too deep in the mountains for a clear signal. Should we wait for backup? I asked. Another scream echoed through the hollow, more desperate than before. If that's the Carruthers girl, she might not have time for backup, Dave said. We approached the settlement carefully, weapons drawn, using the fog and the ramshackle buildings for cover. The place was bigger than I'd expected. Maybe a dozen structures of various sizes, some obviously recent additions to whatever original buildings had been here. Someone had been maintaining this place, improving it. Someone who'd been here for a long time. The screaming was coming from the largest building, a two-story structure that looked like it had been expanded multiple times with whatever materials were available. Corrugated metal, plywood, logs, even what looked like parts of old cars. It was like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. Dave motioned for me to circle around to the back while he approached from the front. I nodded and started working my way through the fog, trying to stay quiet on the leaf-covered ground. That's when I saw the first body. It was hanging from a tree about 30 feet behind the main building, too high up to reach without a ladder. What was left of it, anyway. The clothes were rotted away, but I could see hiking boots, the kind serious backpackers wear. How long had it been there? Months? Years? I forced myself to look away and keep moving. I had to focus on finding Delphine, on getting her out of here alive. But my hands were shaking as I gripped my weapon. I was almost to the back of the building when the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the sound had been. Through a gap in the wall, the building was in rougher shape than it had appeared from a distance. I could see inside. Generator-powered lights hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the walls. And those walls... Jesus Christ, those walls. They were covered with photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Pictures of hikers, campers, park visitors. Some of the photos looked like they'd been taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Others were close-ups, taken when the subjects clearly had no idea they were being photographed. And then I saw the trophies, driver's licenses, jewelry, pieces of clothing, all arranged on makeshift shelves like some kind of twisted museum display. I could see a Vanderbilt University student ID card that had to be Delphine's. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, bringing my weapon up, but I was too slow. Something hard and heavy hit me across the back of the head, and the world exploded into stars and pain. When I came to, I was tied to a chair inside the building. My head felt like someone was driving railroad spikes through it, and my vision was blurry. But I could see well enough to realize that Dave was tied up across the room from me, blood running down his face from a scalp wound. "About time you woke up," a voice said from somewhere behind me. I was starting to worry I'd hit you too hard. The voice was calm, conversational, the kind of voice you'd hear ordering coffee or asking about the weather. That somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been ranting or screaming. Heavy boots walked around to where I could see them. Combat boots well maintained. Tucked into the boots were military-style BDU pants. Above that, a camouflage jacket that looked like it had seen real action. I raised my eyes to look at his face. He was maybe 45, 50 years old with graying hair cut in a military style. Clean-shaven, serious eyes. He looked like he could have been a park ranger himself, or a retired soldier. The kind of man you'd trust to help you if you were lost in the woods. "My name's Clayton Venable," he said, settling into a chair across from me. "This is my family's land. Has been for 4 generations, until the government decided they needed it more than we did." Venable, the name from Delphine's notes. "Where is she?" I asked. My voice came out as a croak. "The girl? Oh, she's safe. For now." He smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Pretty little thing. Reminds me of my sister, actually. Sarah was about her age when she died. Let her go. Let all of us go, and we can work something out." He laughed. "Work something out? You know what you can work out for me, Ranger Mercer? You can get the hell off my land and take your government friends with you. This is a national park. It's not your land anymore." His expression changed instantly, the false friendliness disappearing like smoke. My great-grandfather built the first cabin in this hollow in 1847. My family lived here, farmed here, died here for almost 100 years before you people came in with your eminent domain and your greater good. Bullshit. He stood up and started pacing. You know what they offered my grandfather for this place? $500. $500 for land that had been in our family for 3 generations. When he refused to sell, they just took it anyway. Said it was for the American people. That was 90 years ago, I said. Everyone involved in that decision is long dead. But the park's still here, isn't it? Still keeping people like me off land that should be mine. And every year, more and more of you tourists come tramping through here, disturbing things that should be left alone. Dave was starting to come around, moaning softly. Venable glanced at him, then back at me. I've been watching you people for years, he continued. Learning your routines, your procedures. Did you know that search and rescue teams follow predictable patterns? That you always call for backup at the same points in an operation? That your radios use frequencies I can jam with equipment I bought on eBay? My blood turned to ice. You've been planning this. Planning what? I'm just living on my family's land, same as my ancestors did. It's not my fault if people keep wandering into places they don't belong. He walked over to one of the trophy shelves and picked up what looked like a ranger's badge. Ranger Patricia Kowalski. She was looking for a missing Boy Scout group back in 2018. Sweet lady. Reminded me of my first-grade teacher. I remembered that case. Patty Kowalski had fallen off a cliff during the search, or so we'd thought. Her body had been found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine. Accidental death, the official report had said. You killed her. I defended my property, just like I'm going to defend it from you. The FBI will come looking for us when we don't report in. The FBI will find 2 rangers who got lost in the fog and had a tragic accident. Maybe fell down the same ravine as Ranger Kowalski. These mountains are dangerous, you know. People disappear all the time. He was right, and I knew it. Rangers died in the line of duty every year. Falls, heart attacks, getting lost in bad weather. If Venable was smart about how he disposed of our bodies, it could be weeks before anyone thought to look in Sorrow Hollow. What about Delphine? Oh, she's going to have an accident too. Probably tonight. Young graduate student, inexperienced hiker. Went out in the fog and never came back. Tragic, really. I tested the ropes holding my wrists. They were tight, professionally tied, military knots. You were a soldier, I said. 22 years, Army Special Forces. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. You know what I learned over there? That the most dangerous enemy is the one who knows the terrain better than you do. The one who's been watching you, learning your weaknesses. He walked back to his chair and sat down. I've been watching the Park Service for 15 years. I know which trails you patrol, which areas you avoid. I know that you're understaffed and overworked, that you rely too much on technology and not enough on instinct. How many people have you killed? How many insurgents did I kill overseas? Same answer. As many as I had to. Dave was fully conscious now, testing his own restraints. Venable noticed and smiled. Your partner's awake. Good. I want you both to understand what's going to happen here. He stood up and walked to a military-style footlocker in the corner of the room. When he opened it, I could see weapons, rifles, handguns, knives. All clean, well-maintained. I'm going to give you a 30-minute head start, he said, selecting a rifle that looked like a military sniper weapon. Then I'm going to hunt you down and kill you, just like I've been hunting your colleagues for the past few years. You're insane. I'm a soldier defending his home. The fact that the government doesn't recognize my right to do that doesn't make me insane. He cut our ropes with a combat knife, then stepped back with the rifle trained on us. Moved to the door. Slowly, Dave and I stumbled to our feet. My head was still pounding, and I could see that Dave was having trouble staying upright. Where's Delphine? I asked again. She's in the root cellar behind the house. Still alive for now. If you can get to her and get her out of my territory before I catch up to you, she might stay that way. And if we can't? His smile was back. Then she'll die with you. He motioned us toward the door with the rifle barrel. "Your 30 minutes starts now." We stumbled out into the fog. It had gotten thicker while we were inside, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet. The generator was still humming somewhere behind us, providing the only sound in the unnatural silence of the hollow. "Which way to the root cellar?" Dave whispered. I tried to remember the layout of the settlement from what I'd seen before. Venable knocked me unconscious. "Behind the main building, I think." We moved as quickly as we dared through the fog, trying to stay quiet on the leaf-covered ground. Every shadow could have been Venable. Every sound could have been him tracking us. I found the root cellar by tripping over it. It was built into the side of a small hill, with a wooden door set at ground level. There was a heavy padlock on the door, but the wood around the hinges was rotten. "Help me with this," I whispered to Dave. We both put our shoulders against the door and pushed. The rotten wood gave way with a crack that sounded like gunfire in the silence. "Delphine?" I called softly into the darkness. A weak voice answered from inside. "Help me, please." I dropped down into the cellar. It was maybe 8 feet square, carved out of the earth and lined with stone. Delphine was chained to the far wall, alive but obviously terrified. She was still wearing the clothes Brett had described, but they were dirty and torn. "Are you hurt?" I asked, working at the chains. He's been keeping me here for 2 days. Said he was waiting for someone to come looking for me." Her voice was hoarse, probably from screaming. The chains were secured with another padlock, but this one was newer, stronger. I couldn't break it with my bare hands. "Dave, I need your multi-tool." He dropped down into the cellar and handed me his Leatherman. The bolt cutters were small, but they were better than nothing. It took precious minutes to cut through the chain, and I could hear sounds from the settlement above us. Venable was moving around, probably getting ready to start his hunt. "Can you walk?" I asked Delphine as the last link of chain snapped. "I think so." We helped her out of the cellar. She was weak from being chained up for 2 days, but she seemed uninjured. "Which way?" Dave asked. I tried to orient myself in the fog. The path we'd followed to get here led back toward the Porter's Creek area, but it was a long hike through dangerous terrain. And Venable knew those trails better than we did. "There's got to be another way out," I said. "He's been living up here for years. He'd have more than one escape route." We started moving away from the settlement, trying to put distance between us and Venable. The fog was so thick that we were essentially moving blind, feeling our way from tree to tree. That's when we heard the first shot. The rifle crack echoed through the hollow, impossibly loud in the silence. I couldn't tell which direction it had come from. Sound bounces strangely in mountain terrain, especially in fog. "He started hunting," Dave whispered. We moved faster, half carrying Delphine between us. She was getting stronger as the circulation returned to her legs, but she was still weak from her ordeal. Another shot, closer this time. Then Venable's voice amplified by some kind of loudspeaker. "Ranger Mercer, I know you can hear me. You've got maybe 20 minutes before I track you down. The girl's slowing you down, isn't she? Why don't you leave her and save yourselves? I promise I'll make it quick for her." Dave and I looked at each other. We both knew that abandoning Delphine wasn't an option, but Venable was right. She was slowing us down, and he was gaining on us. "There," Delphine whispered, pointing through the fog. "I think I see a path." She was right. There was what looked like an old deer trail leading downhill, away from the settlement. It was narrow and steep, but it headed in the general direction of the park's main trail system. We started down the path, moving as quickly as we dared. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks, hidden roots, steep drops on either side. But it was our only chance. Behind us, I could hear Venable moving through the forest. He wasn't being particularly quiet. He didn't need to be. He knew these mountains, and he knew we were trapped. "Rangers!" His voice boomed through the fog. "You're going the wrong way. That trail leads to Dead Man's Drop. 40-foot cliff with rocks at the bottom. Nobody's ever survived that fall." He was probably lying, trying to spook us into changing direction, but what if he wasn't? The path continued downhill for maybe half a mile before it leveled out near what looked like a creek bed. The The fog was thinner here, and I could see that we were in some kind of narrow valley with steep walls on both sides. "This feels like a trap," Dave muttered. He was right. If Venable got above us on either ridge, we'd be sitting ducks in the valley floor. That's when my radio crackled. "Base to Mercer, come in." The signal was weak, full of static, but it was there. We'd moved far enough from Venable's jamming equipment to get a partial signal. I grabbed the radio. "Mercer here. Emergency situation. Officer needs assistance." "Say again, Mercer. You're breaking up." "Sorrow Hollow. Armed suspect. 3 people in danger." "Unable to copy. Repeat your location." The signal dissolved back into static. But maybe someone had heard enough to send help. Another rifle shot, much closer now. A bullet whined off a rock maybe 20 feet to our left. "Move!" I shouted. We ran down the creek bed, splashing through ankle-deep water, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I could hear Venable crashing through the forest, no longer bothering with stealth. The creek bed curved to the right and suddenly opened up into a larger stream. And there, unbelievably, was a bridge. Not a Park Service bridge. This was older, made of logs and rope, but it looked sturdy enough. "Where does that lead?" I asked Delphine. "I don't know. I've never been this far from the settlement." Another shot. This one was close enough that I felt the bullet pass by my head. We ran across the bridge. It swayed and creaked under our weight, but it held. On the other side, a better maintained trail led uphill toward what looked like another ridge. "This way," Dave called, starting up the trail. We climbed for maybe 10 minutes before I realized where we were. The trail we were on connected to the Appalachian Trail system. We were still miles from any parking area, but we were back in the official park system. Marked trails, emergency call boxes, regular ranger patrols. That's when I heard the helicopters. The sound was faint at first, but it was getting closer. Someone had heard my radio call and sent help. Venable must have heard them too, because the shooting stopped. We kept climbing until we reached a small clearing where a helicopter could land. The fog was finally starting to lift and I could see the aircraft approaching. A Park Service rescue helicopter with the words, "Great Smoky Mountains National Park," painted on the side. As the helicopter settled onto the ground, I turned back toward the valley we'd just climbed out of. Somewhere down there, Clayton Venable was retreating to his compound, probably destroying evidence, preparing for the manhunt that was about to begin. But we'd made it out alive. All 3 of us. The pilot was someone I knew, Jake Morrison, a 10-year veteran of Park Service rescue operations. As we helped Delphine into the helicopter, he shouted over the rotor noise, "What the hell happened down there?" "Radio it in," I shouted back. "Armed suspect in the Sorrow Hollow area. Multiple homicides. We need FBI, we need tactical teams, and we need them now." The helicopter lifted off, carrying us back towards civilization. As we flew over the fog-shrouded mountains, I could see smoke rising from several different locations in the remote areas of the park. Venable wasn't the only one living off-grid in the Smokies. The FBI manhunt lasted 3 weeks. They found Venable's compound, found the trophies, found evidence linking him to at least 7 unsolved disappearances over the past decade. But they never found Venable himself. He'd vanished into the mountains like smoke, taking his knowledge of every hidden trail and secret cave with him. The tactical teams searched every inch of the Sorrow Hollow area, but it was like he'd never existed. The official report concluded that he'd probably died in the wilderness. Exposure, animal attack, maybe suicide rather than face capture. But I never believed that. A man with his survival skills, his knowledge of the terrain. He was still out there somewhere. That's why I moved to Nevada. That's why I wake up at 3 in the morning hearing sounds that shouldn't exist. Because somewhere in those Tennessee mountains, Clayton Venable is still hunting. The Park Service offered me a promotion, a transfer to a cushy desk job in Washington. They wanted to turn me into a poster boy for Ranger heroism, probably use the story for recruitment videos. I turned it all down. I couldn't go back to those mountains, couldn't walk those trails knowing that somewhere in the fog and shadows, a predator was watching, waiting. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, every shadow that moved wrong. It all reminded me that the worst monsters in any wilderness aren't the ones with claws and fangs. Dave Rodriguez retired early. He'd been thinking about it anyway, and the Venable incident pushed him over the edge. Last I heard, he'd moved to Florida, bought a little house near the beach where he could see for miles in every direction. Wide open spaces, no trees, no places for anyone to hide. Delphine Carruthers never finished her research project. She transferred to a different university, changed her major to something that didn't require fieldwork. The last time we spoke, about 6 months after the incident, she told me she still couldn't sleep without all the lights on. She'd developed severe agoraphobia, afraid of open spaces, afraid of being alone, afraid of anywhere she couldn't see every possible approach. The families of Venable's other victims finally got some closure. Patricia Kowalski's family learned that her death hadn't been an accident. The parents of 3 missing hikers from 2019 were able to hold memorial services. But closure is a relative term when the killer is still out there somewhere. The FBI kept the case open for 2 years before moving it to cold case status. They had agents stationed in the park for months, following up on every reported sighting, every strange sound in the night. But you can't patrol 1 million acres of wilderness indefinitely, and eventually, budget realities forced them to scale back. I kept in touch with the lead investigator, Agent Sarah Chen, for a while. She was convinced that Venable had died in the mountains, said that no one could survive a Tennessee winter in the backcountry without proper shelter and supplies. But she'd never worked in the Smokies, never understood how many forgotten places exist in those mountains. Caves, abandoned mines, old logging camps that haven't been on any map for decades. 3 months after the manhunt officially ended, a hiker found a park ranger's uniform hanging from a tree near the Chimney Tops Trail. The uniform belonged to Marcus Williams, a seasonal ranger who'd been reported missing 2 weeks earlier. His body was never found, but there were signs of a struggle at his last known location, scuff marks in the dirt, equipment scattered around like he'd dropped it while running. The Park Service called it a bear attack. Bears don't hang uniforms from trees as trophies. 6 months later, another incident. A family camping at Elkmont reported that someone had been watching their campsite during the night. They'd seen a figure in the tree line just standing there, motionless, for hours. When they called out, the figure had melted back into the forest without making a sound. The parents described the watcher as a middle-aged man in military-style clothing. Park security did a sweep of the area, but found nothing except some boot prints that could have belonged to anyone. That's when I knew for certain that Venable was still alive, still hunting. The FBI might have given up, but he hadn't. If anything, the manhunt had probably made him more careful, more cunning. He'd learned from the experience, adapted his methods. I submitted my resignation a week after the Elkmont incident. I couldn't keep working in a place where I knew a killer was stalking rangers and visitors alike. Couldn't keep sending search teams into areas where they might become the hunted instead of the hunters. My supervisor tried to talk me out of it, said I was letting fear make my decisions, that the park needed experienced rangers now more than ever. Maybe he was right. But I'd seen what Venable was capable of, and I wasn't willing to risk other people's lives on the assumption that he was gone. The move to Nevada was harder than I'd expected. After 7 years of Tennessee humidity and green mountains, the desert felt like another planet. But that was exactly what I needed. A landscape so different from the Smokies that it couldn't trigger the memories. No fog, no thick forests, no places for anyone to hide and watch. I got a job with the Bureau of Land Management doing mostly paperwork and vehicle maintenance. Not glamorous work, but it kept me employed and let me stay connected to public lands without having to deal with search and rescue operations. My wife, Sarah, was patient with me during the transition. She'd known something was wrong from the moment I came home after the helicopter rescue, but I hadn't told her the full story until months later. The nightmares, the jumping at shadows, the way I'd freeze up whenever we drove past forested areas. She dealt with all of it without complaint. But even she didn't understand the full extent of what those mountains had taken from me. It wasn't just my career or my peace of mind. It was my faith in the fundamental safety of the wilderness. For most of my adult life, I'd believed that nature was dangerous but predictable. Wild animals followed instincts, weather followed patterns, geological hazards could be mapped and avoided. Clayton Venable had shown me that the most unpredictable danger in any wilderness was human intelligence combined with malevolent intent. A predator who could think, plan, adapt, who could use the environment itself as a weapon. That's the thing that keeps me awake at 3 in the morning. Not just the memory of what happened, but the knowledge of what's still happening. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that Venable didn't stop hunting when we escaped. If anything, our survival probably enraged him, made him more determined to prove that his territory was inviolate. About a year after I moved to Nevada, I started getting emails from other Park Service employees, rangers mostly, but also some law enforcement officers and search and rescue coordinators. Word had gotten around about what really happened in Sorrow Hollow, and people were sharing their own stories. A ranger in Yosemite wrote about finding human bones in areas where no one should have been able to reach without technical climbing equipment. A search coordinator in Glacier National Park described a pattern of missing persons cases that all shared certain characteristics. Experienced hikers, traveling alone, last seen in remote areas where cell coverage was poor. Most disturbing was an email from a retired ranger in Olympic National Park. He'd worked there for 25 years before moving to Arizona, and he was convinced that there was an organized network of people living in the deep wilderness of various parks. Not just hermits or survivalists, but active predators who used the vast, unpatrolled backcountry as hunting grounds. He'd documented 17 disappearances over his career that fit the pattern, all in areas where official search efforts had been hampered by terrain or weather, all involving people who should have known better than to venture into such remote locations alone. The official explanations were always the same: exposure, falls, bear attacks, getting lost. But this ranger had noticed things that others missed. Trail markers moved from their proper locations. Caches of supplies hidden in areas where no legitimate backcountry user would need them. Signs of permanent habitation in places where camping was prohibited and foot traffic was supposed to be minimal. The email ended with a warning. Whatever you encountered in Tennessee isn't unique. There are others out there in parks across the country. The federal agencies know about it but can't admit it publicly without causing panic. They'd rather people believe that wilderness deaths are natural accidents than acknowledge that some of our most beautiful public lands have become hunting preserves for human predators. I never responded to that email, but I kept it, printed it out and filed it away with all the other evidence I'd collected over the years. FBI reports, newspaper clippings, missing person flyers. The beginning of a pattern that I was probably the only person in a position to recognize. Because here's what I learned during my 7 years as a ranger, and what the Venable incident confirmed. The National Park Service processes somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 missing person reports every year. Most of those people are found within 48 hours. Lost day hikers, kids who wandered away from campsites, elderly visitors with dementia who got confused. But about 300 people disappear in national parks every year and are never found. Never. Their cases go cold. Their families eventually stop calling for updates, and they become statistics in government databases that most people never see. 300 people, every year, in locations that are supposed to be protected, patrolled, and safe for public recreation. The official explanations are always the same: falls, exposure, animal attacks, drowning. And most of the time, those explanations are probably correct. But what if they're not? What if even 10% of those cases involve human predators like Clayton Venable? That would mean 30 people are murdered in national parks every year, and nobody talks about it because the alternative, admitting that some of America's most iconic landscapes have become hunting grounds for human monsters, is too terrifying for the public to accept. I think about those numbers every time I wake up at 3 in the morning. Every time I hear sounds that my rational mind knows are just the house settling or the wind rattling a window. Because somewhere in the Smoky Mountains, or the Rockies, or the Cascades, or any of dozens of other wilderness areas, Clayton Venable and others like him are still out there. Still hunting, still collecting trophies, still proving that sometimes the most dangerous predator in any ecosystem walks on 2 legs and thinks like a human being. The Park Service will never admit this publicly. They can't. Tourism brings in billions of dollars annually, and even a hint that visitors might be stalked by human predators would devastate the industry. So they maintain the fiction that wilderness deaths are natural accidents, that proper preparation and common sense are sufficient protection against the dangers of the backcountry. But I know better. I've seen the evidence, lived through the reality, and every time someone asks me why I left such a rewarding career, why I moved so far from the mountains I used to love, I tell them about equipment failures and budget cuts and bureaucratic frustrations. I never tell them about Clayton Venable. I never mention the trophies on his walls or the screams echoing through mountain fog, or the way a human predator can turn the most beautiful landscape in America into a hunting ground that would make wolves jealous. Because the truth is too terrible for most people to accept. The truth is that when you venture into the deep wilderness, you're not just risking exposure or animal attacks or getting lost. You're entering territory where human monsters have learned to thrive, where the very remoteness that makes these places beautiful also makes them perfect for predators who hunt the most dangerous game of all. That's why I moved to Nevada. That's why I work a desk job now instead of hiking mountain trails. And that's why, even 3 years later in a house over 1,000 miles from Tennessee, I still wake up at 3 in the morning listening for the sound of boots crunching through autumn leaves. Because somewhere in those mountains, Clayton Venable is still out there. And he's not the only one.